It's time again to do some more Prusa multi-material unit content. Today we're going to take a look at the RMU MK3. Hello everyone, Chris here, and it has been a while since I've done anything with the Prusa MMU2, the multi-material unit you can get for your Prusa printer. And if you are an MMU2 user, you know that how difficult it can be to deal with all of the filament spools that you have to use one of these. There can be up to 5 in play all at once. Not only do you have to deal with all the different spools, but you have to deal with the retraction of that filament when it's not in use. And Prusa does offer a filament buffer to try to control this, but I never really had a lot of luck using it. So let's start there. So this is the buffer option that comes in the MMU2S kit. It's designed to hook onto the back of the printer like this. This just hooks on that back plate. But then you have filament coming in, and it makes an entire loop inside here, and then it comes out the corresponding hole on the other side. So filament spools in one side, going out to the MMU2, the PTFE tubes, on the other. And it's 5-tiered, so you have one flat section inside here for each filament. And those that aren't familiar with this process, when you're not using the filament, it's actually going to have a big loop of filament inside here. That's because it's hard to automate it, putting it back on the spool when it's not being used by the printer. And those that aren't familiar with this process, basically we have one nozzle, multiple extruders. The MMU2 just feeds it down the Bowden tube to the direct drive gears, and it does this with each one as it needs it. So you're pulling filament off the spool from the back, pulling it down to the drive gears, using it, and then you're putting it back. Well, when you put it back, all of that you've already pulled off the spool has to go someplace, or it's just going to be loose. And that can cause a lot of different issues. So you have to have some sort of management system. As I said, I never really had a lot of luck with the Prusa buffer. It always seemed to get hung up sometimes. And there are different solutions out there. And this is one of the projects that I actually like the best. It's called the gravity spool holder. So your spool would set down here. You have this piece that will guide it to the MMU2. You load your PTFE tube here that comes out of the back of the MMU2. It sets right here. As the MMU2 pulls in filament, it rolls the filament spool back. And then when it's done with it and it starts to release it, gravity puts the filament back on the spool. And these do work pretty well. They are kind of loud, and once in a while the gravity when pulling that spool back is strong enough to actually pull the filament out of the back of the MMU2. So it's not a foolproof solution, but it does work. There's also another design that has a spring in it that allows you to rewind the spool back onto the filament. I don't have one to show you, but I can pull one up. This is the Rewinder project. So basically it's achieving the same thing, only as you pull the filament out, it winds up a spring, adding tension. You can see the spring right in here. And then when you release the filament, when you're done with it, the spring is going to pull it back and put it back on the spool. So that's another option. But here's where the Wedge Group comes in with the RMU MK3, or the Retraction Management Unit. They've tried to take a lot of the guesswork out of all these different devices just to manage those spools. And this makes it a lot simpler to deal with that, and you don't have to put so much thought into how you use your filament spools, or even the real estate that they take up while they're in use. You can usually just use any spool holder to deal with this. So let's just take a quick look at it. So here it is as it sets on the printer. There are 2 different versions. I'll go into that more. There's a top load like this one, so the filament comes down and loads in here, or there's a side load, that's this one over here. The filament's going to load on this side. Basically what happens, the filament comes in, it goes around a set of these idler gears, and then feeds back into this tube to go into the MMU2. When you're not using the filament, the loop of filament goes down into this chamber, which is divided into 5 different chambers, one for each filament. It goes all the way to the end of this buffer, and it sits there and waits until you want to use it again. And I've already logged many hours on this unit, and it has been flawless. I haven't had any issues with my filament at all. And of course, there's all kinds of information about it and this kit on their site, including videos, how to load it, how to assemble it, and how this whole thing works. And the Wedge Group was nice enough to send over a couple of kits so I could check this out. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you all the printed parts, all the parts that the Wedge Group will send you, how to put the whole thing together, how to get it set up, and then we're going to do some test prints. So let's get into it. So here's a look at all the printed parts we're going to use. I do have both types of top, the side mount and the top, but we'll talk about that in a moment. I did use all Prusa orange and black. It's important to mention that the RMU Mark III is not an open source project. You can buy it directly from the Wedge Group. You can either get it as just STLs, you can get STLs and all the fittings, or you can get it fully assembled. But to build this, you will need 5 of these idlers. That's what the filament actually wraps around. 2 of the axle pins. The idlers and the door hinge use these. These are the axle washers. There's 4 of those. You have the catch pieces that hold the door closed, both sides of the hinge and the handle. You have the brackets to mount it on the printer, the upper and the lower. A couple of these T-nut pieces. And some of these to hold the tubes together, kind of keeps things organized. I printed out 3. We'll see how many we actually need. And then you have the lower body here. This is the same for both styles of kit. And then these are both styles. So this is the side one, and this is the top one. And that's just how you want the filament to be fed in. I'm going to go with the top one for this install because I think I'm going to hang my spools up above. But if you want to run them in from the side, they would go like this from the back of the printer. This whole thing installs on the left-hand side of the printer. They'd run in like this. And then for the non-printed parts, we have some 608 bearings, 1 for each idler wheel. We have 5 M10 pass-through couplers, and then some M3x10 and 20mm screws, and some M3 nuts. You also get these different length PTFE tubes, so you can get it hooked up correctly to your MMU2. So we'll start with the idler wheels. We're just going to press a 608 bearing into each one of them. You want to make sure you get it all the way in there. You don't want any gaps. If you flip it over, you shouldn't have any gap in between the bearing and that printed part. Then we'll take our preferred top section. Again, I'm going to go with the T model, the top loader. And we can slide each wheel in. It's going to kind of bend this part out of the way so that it can slip in. We'll do all 5 of those. This is probably why they recommend PETG, because it is just a little bit more flexible. PLA, you might not be able to get this done. You might break it. So consider that. Make sure all these are spinning freely, and they are. Then we'll take one of our pins, put the taper in first, and it can just go through the side. You kind of have to line these wheels up to get it to work in, but it should press pretty freely. And just push it in until it's flush. And then these axle pin washers and M3x10mm screws will keep that from moving around. So I can just put one in this side, and then one on this side. Don't get too carried away with tightening it down. Make sure everything's still spinning freely. You do want as little sideways movement as possible. Just be careful when you're tightening those up. It is a 3D printed part. And then this whole thing will set on this housing. This is the hinge, so it's actually kind of a door mechanism. Just slides on like that. And then there's another pin that goes through here. And then we're going to do the same thing. M3x10s and our axle washers. One on this side, and then one on the other side. So now we have our hinge mechanism. You can open it, check it out, or load it up. It's very convenient. Then our catch lever to keep it closed goes on this side. So it's going to snap up. So the larger hinge piece, we're just going to load that latch. It will screw in right here, M3x10mm screws, and then you have a smaller latch on top to keep it. So it goes right like this. There's the latch pieces on, and then it just closes up like that. Now we can go ahead and put all our pass-through couplers up here. There's 10 of them in total. Remember, this is the top mechanism, the one that feeds from the top. The side, you'll have some down below, and then some on top. Also, it's important to note, if you are self-sourcing this build and you're trying to get some couplers, there's a lot of different thread sizes for these. These are PC4 M10s. Just make sure you're getting the right ones. that are compatible with these threads in these holes. So we're just going to finger tight all 10 of them and make sure they're nice and straight. And then when you get them all finger tight and they're nice and straight, it is kind of easy to cross thread these. You can go ahead and snug them up with a wrench or a socket. Make sure all of them are right up against the plastic. You don't want any gaps in between there. You don't want to be able to see any thread. Then we're ready to put our upper assembly onto our body. This is where the filament actually gets fed down into when the filament unloads. We're going to put an M3 nut in here, and then M3 nuts get loaded in all the other tabs. And you're probably pretty used to this if you've built your Prusa kit, but if you're having problems getting these nuts pressed in, you can always pull them through with a screw. You just want to make sure they're nice and snug in the part. And then to attach it, this longer piece right here, it goes on the same side as the door hinge. So it goes just like this. And you just use some more M3x10s to put it together. And we're assembled. Now we're going to put together some of the brackets that actually attach it to the printer. These act as T-nuts. We're going to put 2 M3s, one in each one of these. Again, you can pull them through the screw if you need to. And then we're going to do 2 M3x20s. And these will just loosely thread on these T-nuts we just prepared. And they're going to work just like a T-nut to go on the side of the extrusion on the Mark III. And on the other piece, we also need to set a couple of M3 nuts in here. Once you have that done, we can pull the Mark III up here and attach it. So here's our Mark III. Again, this whole unit attaches to the left side of the printer, right under here, underneath the control box. So your bracket with the printed T-nuts, it just slides into this extrusion, and you want it just right up here to the back plate. It's going to hit right there, and then you can spin those T-nuts. Make sure they're actually moving. You should be able to feel them grip. So there's the bottom bracket. And the top bracket actually goes in a couple of holes that are already on your Prusa machine. So it's the side of this bracket that doesn't have the nuts loaded. It just goes right here. These are threaded holes. M3x10mm screws. And then your buffer, these two are going to set right here on that top bracket, right in these. And then there's 2 on the bottom that go in the 2 holes on these bottom bracket. And those are all 4 M3x20s. And then on this side of this bracket here, those also have some M3 nuts that go inside that plastic part. Now we're going to put our output PTFE tubes on. They are all different lengths. The shortest one is number 1, longest one is number 5. It's easier if you don't remove the tape. On the top version, the outputs are right here. On the side version, they are also on the top. The inputs are going to be over here. You can put one of those tube minders on. It makes it a little easier. They are numbered. But this side is the number 1. This side's the number 5. Because 1's going to be a lot shorter, it's going to go into the MMU2 on this side. And once you've got them started, you can open the door and we'll take a look in here. You want the tube to go in just far enough to be flush with this printed part. Right there. There we go. We can go ahead and close it back up for now. And now we can go ahead and attach it on the MMU side. This one does have a few modifications on it. I've got couplers on mine, but it's going to work the same. Now that we have the tubes wrangled, we can go ahead and take our tape off. And you can use another one of these tube minders if you like, but we'll just start with 1. It's the shortest. 2, 3, 4, and 5. And there we go, a nice tidy install. Short of loading the filament, we're pretty much done. So here's a look at the spool holder setup that we're going to use with this buffer. I'm just hanging 5 spools from the rafters on a piece of PVC. This is traditionally what I do here in the basement. Now the printer is down to the right of these spools, but with this buffer, we should be able to direct the filament into the top of it much easier. So I've got the stock PTFE tubes that come with the MMU2 on this side. It would probably be best if they were long enough to go all the way towards the spool, but the buffer separates the filament good enough that it shouldn't get tangled. I'm also using some of those printed minders that came with the kit, just so I know which one is 1, which one is 5. So I'm just going to pull each filament down and load it in its tube. And I'm just going to push them in just until it gets in the buffer. So all the filament is loaded down to the buffer. You can see it comes in on the far side. Remember, the other design would come in over here. But then we can just open the top of the buffer up, and then we'll just pull each one of the filaments through around its own wheel and go back into the other PTFE tube that heads to the MMU2. I'm just going to get all 5 started, then we'll start the loading sequence on the LCD. So I've got all 5 of them started. Now we'll start the load all sequence. Let's go into the menu, load filament, and then we're going to say load all. So that's going to put the MMU on filament 1, and it's just going to sit there and continuously try to pull in the filament and trigger that FINDA probe. So while that cycle's going, we have filament 1. I'm just going to keep feeding it until the MMU2 grabs it. Now it's pulling it in. Now it's going to push it back out and move to the next one. I don't feed them all in before I start the loading sequence because that selector can actually cut it off. It can get jammed in there. We grabbed it. On to the next one. And we'll just do all 5. Now all 5 are loaded, ready to go. Just make sure you're not clipping any of these filaments, and then you can go ahead and close your buffer and latch it. Now we are ready to print. And the RMU is not necessarily going to help your print quality, but I know a lot of you wanted to see the turtle that we printed, and it came out great. Should have adjusted some of the purging volumes. I got a little green on the back of my shell here, but you know, it is a turtle after all. So there it is, the Wedge Group RMU Mark III. And this thing really did work flawlessly. I've done many prints on it, and I haven't had one filament issue. Also, being able to hang those spools on the ceiling makes things just a lot easier. I don't have to worry about minding the filament so much. So I really like this product. Now, a lot of people are going to say that the price is too high on something like this, and it's not open source. But if you really want to use your Prusa MMU2 without a lot of hassle, like I know a lot of users do, you definitely want to check this thing out. This might be the solution for a lot of you out there. So hopefully you liked this video. That's it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.